The Laws of Disguise is a 2016 horror thriller tragedy novella by Gregoire Courtois. It was originally published in French and was translated by Rhonda Mullins. I think I found this one randomly at the bookstore originally. It was short in the premise. A bunch of little kids go out for a camping trip and, after some unnamed danger strikes, run off into the woods to face the dangers of the wilderness. Smelled a little bit like it might have had the same vibes the troop had. But I read it and I enjoyed it, and I figured I might as well reread it and go into some of the things I liked about it. So the story follows 15 people going into the wilderness for a camping trip. A class of 12 6-year-olds, 2 of their mothers, and a teacher. Apparently they're in the Morvan, a natural park area in central France. Gorgeous place, actually. The main conflict of the story unfolds as a series of unfortunate events. Natalie, mother to Hugo, becomes violently ill and needs to go home. So Sandra, mother to Jade, calls her husband, Olivier, to come pick Natalie up. Olivier had settled in for the night and indulged in some whiskey, and resentfully comes to get Natalie while drunk. He arrives late, with Sandra and Natalie having been away from the campfire for a while. Olivier takes off with Natalie, and by now the drunkenness has really taken hold. He attempts to grope Natalie and ends up going off the road into a pond. The car is submerged and both Olivier and Natalie are killed. Sandra, completely unaware of this, now has to hike back up to the campsite in the dark, quickly becoming lost. What she doesn't realize is that by now, Fred, the teacher, is dead and the kids have scattered. Enzo is a very troubled little boy, a bully and a budding psychopath who's being abused by his father. Things begin to degrade when Enzo maliciously kills a snail, and 2 girls, Yasmin and Emma, get him in trouble for it. This trouble compounds later on at the campfire when he deliberately sets classmate Lucas's pants on fire. This culminates in Enzo sneaking up behind Fred at the campfire and bashing his head in with a rock. The remaining 11 children panic and scatter into the wilderness. What unfolds over the next 2 days is a tragedy of epic proportions. One by one, through a variety of mishaps and instances of violence, the children and Sandra all die. The last 2 survivors are Hugo and Enzo, who scrap for a bit before Hugo, injured, manages to subdue Enzo and restrain him. Hugo tries to walk to the road, but eventually collapses and dies. Enzo is consumed by a wild boar in what is arguably the most graphic scene in the book. Hugo's body is the first to be found when help finally comes. So the first interesting thing about this novella is that it gives away the ending pretty much immediately. It describes the kids getting onto the bus and then tells you flat out that none of them are going home. These kids are going to die. And there was part of me, the first time I read the book anyway, that wondered if the author was going to play this straight or if he was going to do a little twist. Like maybe one of the kids gets found and rescued but isn't returned home for one reason or another. Nope. Every character on that bus is dead by the end of this book. It isn't often that you have a horror book that focuses so closely on the deaths of multiple young children. Oh, but Jenny, kids die all the time in horror. Yeah, of course they do, but oftentimes those deaths are not portrayed on screen, so to speak, or if they are, they tend not to be depicted in a super graphic way. The general trend within horror is that child death gets treated a little more carefully than adult death. Sometimes because the author themselves is sensitive to portraying such things, or because they're concerned about getting backlash from their audience, who will probably be sensitive about such things. Now, bear in mind, this isn't playground levels of child death, although Enzo's does come close. I had actually forgotten just how horrifying his death was, with the author going for like 4 or 5 pages describing the boar consuming him bit by bit and Enzo's pain and perception of the situation. I would argue that what the children's deaths lack in blood and gore, they make up for in tragedy and psychological pain. One child, Oceane, ironically, drowns. And though her death isn't violent, it hurts because you picture this little 6-year-old girl trying to swim across a lake and ending up too tired to keep going, unable to be saved, and her last word before going under is, "Mommy." 3 other children, Mathis, Lilou, and Raphael, all eat berries because they're hungry, and, as you might expect, the berries are poisonous and the children become violently ill, vomiting and cramping and seizing as they die. The author lingers not just on the physicality of their deaths, but the psychological nature of what they're experiencing, giving us insight into their childlike understanding of their situations. On page 120, he says, quote, "Children die without having had a chance to picture the end, without a sense of it being born and maturing within them. They die the same way that they get lice or a skinned knee. They die without understanding, with their childish naivete imagining death the way that they imagine April showers, meteorological inevitability that eventually pass, not knowing or realizing that this inevitability does not pass." Unquote. The mentality of a young child is explored at length in the novella, highlighting the psychology behind their choices and their understanding of a situation absent of an adult's guidance or contextualization. I think this is a big part of what makes the book so deeply sad. These are 6-year-olds. Usually 6-year-olds in horror novels have adults and parents to protect and guide them through whatever is happening, or give them some illusion of protection and a sense of comfort at least. But in this case, they have no one and have to fend for themselves. And rather than conjure up a scenario where things turn out okay, the author goes for brutal realism. A bunch of scared 6-year-olds in the woods on their own, especially with a specific threat present, would not be okay. They would eat poisonous berries because they're hungry and they don't know better. They'll run through the forest and end up falling down an incline and breaking their necks because they don't know better. They'll try to swim across a lake to get help because they don't know better. The only slightly unrealistic threat here, the catalyst to the main conflict of the story, is Enzo. I'd argue it's not overly likely that a 6-year-old would effectively become a serial killer in the span of 2 days, but I would also argue that the author does a good job at explaining Enzo's thought process. He has a great deal of repressed rage towards his father, and he attacks Fred because he's angry at being punished for his behavior. His mindset is one of might makes right, and the notion that anyone who would stop him from doing what he wants to do is deeply infuriating to him. Incidentally, Enzo is also the big driving reason behind the deaths in this story. Aside from being outright responsible for the deaths of 5 characters, murdering Fred drives the rest of the children into the forest, afraid for their lives, which consequently causes them to make rash decisions. Louis is the first kid to die after accidentally falling down an incline and breaking his neck because he's running in a dark forest at night. Oceane tries to swim across the lake because she's the best swimmer and they need help. Yasmin and Emma reach the road, but accidentally run out directly in front of a trailer because Enzo's not far behind them. One could argue that the story might have turned out differently if not for Enzo's behavior. I've gone a bit off track, but circling back to the general topic of how the violence and child death is covered in this book, I would argue that the big difference between Laws of the Skies and something like Playground, for example, is that the graphic content is handled differently. Playground focuses heavily on the gore and the guts of the dead children, and in a 300-plus page novel, that's saying something. There's also a whole lot of other degenerate stuff in the novel when the blood and gore isn't the center focus. Laws of the Skies definitely has gory moments, and even the non-gory deaths are graphic in describing the pain the children are experiencing, and, as I mentioned before, the unique sting of their innocent minds experiencing terror and not quite comprehending what's happening to them. This novella zooms in heavily on their emotional experience of death in a way that Playground really doesn't, as, if I recall correctly anyway, all the deaths in that book are being witnessed by a third party. The emphasis of the brutality comes from the spectacularly graphic nature of the child's death from the outside, not their actual experience of dying. I would also argue that there's a different mood here where the graphic content is concerned. Where Playground, being splatterpunk and extreme horror, seems to revel in the blood, the gore, the degenerate, and otherwise terrible behaviors of its characters, Laws of the Skies takes a more solemn tone. The graphic nature of the children's deaths isn't meant to satisfy a desire for the disgusting and the extreme, but rather give the viewer a taste of the brutal reality of the situation. This isn't slides with saws in them, it's not a monstrous game of hopscotch. It's a very realistic scenario that real-life children could find themselves in and how they might actually handle themselves. Where in Playground, there's a tacit understanding that Aaron Beauregard is trying to gross out and disturb his audience as much as possible, which is the nature of extreme horror. Gregoire Courtois seems to be aiming for the horror and the tragedy of innocent children being condemned to fates they don't deserve. I've touched on this a bit already, but exploration of the nature of childhood innocence is a major theme throughout the book. Oftentimes the author elaborates on the children's psyches, on how they navigate social situations, and how their imaginations and limited world experience affect how they handle situations. Another major theme in the book is the brutality of nature. The title of the book, The Laws of the Skies, comes from a story Fred tells the children right before his death. A little mouse wants to fly with the birds and see the beautiful world from on high, so she fashions wings for herself and manages to fly. The birds then teach her the laws of the skies. Law 1, the skies belong to birds, and birds alone. Law 2, anything that is not a bird and flies to the skies is considered bird food. And Law 3, what cannot be eaten by the birds and still flies should not be allowed to admire the wonders of the sky. That's when they peck the mouse's eyes out. The story, aside from being an origin tale about bats, seems to function as a sort of metaphor for the natural order of things. The mouse was one thing, it rose above its station, and so it must be punished. It also serves as a reminder that nature is not kind, and real-life animals are not harmless Disney creatures. Aside from Enzo, the greatest threat to the children in this book is nature. One child drowns, 3 die from eating poisonous berries, and another falls and breaks his neck. Enzo himself is eventually consumed by a boar. Nature is not kind, and just as the birds in the story did not care about the mouse's humble and innocent desire to experience flight, nature does not care that these little kids are innocent and don't deserve to die. Enzo directly invokes the story across a few pages from 81 to 82, saying, quote, "Once upon a time, the mice did their homework and answered all the nice teacher's questions, and they knew that if they worked hard and were obedient, they could fly like birds. But it was a special class, a class of mice that also had a beautiful eagle in it. Not an ugly old seagull, but a beautiful, majestic eagle with a white head and a yellow beak. But you know, the eagle, he didn't give a hoot about working hard to learn to fly. The eagle had been flying since he was little. The eagle didn't have a choice, did he? When you jump out of the nest, you either fly or you crash at the foot of the mountain. The eagle has to fly or he's not a real eagle, you see? No, you don't see, because you are all little mice. All of you, do you hear me? And do you know what eagles eat?" Unquote. Enzo's retelling serves 2 points. One, it serves to establish that he's the predator in a position of power, and his classmates are the prey. This is the way of nature. Some animals are predators and some are prey, and it is the nature of the strong to overpower the weak, something that Enzo says directly earlier on in the book. 2, it juxtaposes Enzo's lack of innocence, his perception that he's better and stronger than his classmates, with the other children who are innocent and vulnerable. Both things, again, reinforce this idea of a natural hierarchy, the strong dominating the weak. I thought it was a solid way to drive the point home. The writing overall is very good. The style is interesting, in part because there are several places in the novel where the author deliberately merges from one POV into another, but this is at its most effective during the lead up to Olivier and Natalie's deaths and Fred's murder. I can't really quote it because the context would require me to quote paragraphs of material, but for example, Enzo goes from musing about his understanding of the world to the narration, suddenly cutting back to Olivier's narration. Fred describes the mouse screaming as her eyes are gouged out, and suddenly we're in Natalie's head with her wanting to scream. It's a very interesting way to structure the story, and I'd argue it helped give me a sense that the tension was building. We keep cutting back and forth between these perspectives because several things are about to happen. A few things are building up and you want to see how it's going to play out. Another interesting note about the writing is that at one point, the author actually breaks the fourth wall and addresses the audience directly, saying on page 68, quote, "The cries of the children calling for their mothers had filled the space and made everything tremble, tremors that reached the most obtrusive sensibilities, moving anyone who could detect the vibration. That is, anyone other than you, dear reader, who have the privilege and curse of grasping the unbearable bird's-eye view of a forest plunged into the darkness of one inconsequential night, from which rise the cries of help of children left to their own devices, and children who have died, or will die, and whose salvation you can do nothing for. That is your lot, and that is theirs, tragic roles that each will have to play as best they can until the last page." Unquote. In a different book, this might come across as cheesy or maybe a little bit edgy, but I would argue that the author constructed this book in such a way with his writing that this brief moment of addressing the audience feels very natural. We, as the audience, do have to watch this situation unfold, knowing the children are doomed and feeling terribly about it, but not being able to do anything about it. Drives a dagger into your heart just a little bit deeper. I think when I first read this book, I was a little on whether or not it qualified as a horror book necessarily. It's a novella, pretty short overall, and it doesn't take very long for the action to kick off, and there are some rather horrifying moments in the book, such as, for the 5,000th time, Enzo's demise. I think part of what made me about the horror was the fact that the author tipped us off about all the kids dying at the beginning, so some of that natural tension is removed. I know the kids are all going to die, so I don't feel any sense of suspense when they encounter danger, only a sense of dread and sadness. It's mostly a tragedy. Again, knowing the kids are all doomed just kind of made me sad, because while we don't get to know them super intimately as characters, the author does a remarkable job at telling us just enough about them and their inner worlds to make their deaths incredibly sad to witness. And every time one dies, every time one of those kids cry for their mothers, you're hit with the gut punch of they're never going home again. It's a very emotionally heavy book. This did ultimately have similar vibes to The Troop. Brutal, sad, large cast of child characters, and one of those characters happens to be a deranged psychopath. So if you like The Troop and are looking for something similar, you might enjoy this one. Otherwise, if you're in the mood for a good cry, you might like this one for that purpose as well. But in general, I recommend The Laws of the Skies for being a very well-written novella that's absolutely heart-wrenching to read.